back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. Today's topic is always a popular one, and that is the 2026 Blue Note Tone Poet release calendar. So in this video, I'm not only going to tell you what titles are coming when, I'm going to show you what they look like, give you my opinion on just how worthy these titles are of the release treatment, and then I'm going to close with a summary of the ones that I'm most looking forward to. Before we dive in, as always, please do hit subscribe, and also know that you can check out my brand new release that my own label is putting out of Pepper Adams Quintet, originally put out in 1957. We're getting great reviews, but we do have plenty of copies left, and do know that we rely on sort of word of mouth to help spread awareness of the release. It makes a great holiday gift. But all right, enough of the commercial. Let's dive in. All right, so what we're going to cover is 25 titles. So if you kind of follow me, there's 2 titles per month, and then they've also announced just the first of the quarterly exclusive titles that is only available to the Tone Poet Society members, so 25 titles in total. And just some quick high-level stats, though, before we get into the specific titles, and these are sort of some of the things, sort of some of the reasons, I think, why this is an exciting list. So firstly, out of the 25 titles, 22 of them were originally put out on Blue Note. That leaves 2 that were put out on Pacific, and 1 that was on Jazz West. Out of those 22 titles, 11 of them have not been a part of any other recent quality reissue program. So not Blue Note 75, not the Classic series, Music Matters, Analog Productions, the Classic Records series, VMP, etc. Right? So those are ones that don't really have recent repetition. 5 of these titles were released in the 1500 series era, which for those of you who don't care about catalog numbers, it's really like the earliest of the Blue Note label, at least in terms of their 12-inch releases, and many people sort of believe that they have a different sort of cachet, I guess. And then something that's pretty close to my heart, actually. 3 of these titles were originally shelved and only released decades later, and I love it when they sort of focus in on some of these, and to some extent give some of these titles their first proper reissue, right? Otherwise, a couple of the particulars that have not changed from other years of the Tone Poet series. We have Joe Harley as the producer. We have Kevin Gray doing the mastering from the original master tapes. These are on 180-gram vinyl, pressed at RTI, and packaged, as always, in a gatefold tip-on jacket. Now, I say that there could be some exceptions for specific releases. They don't always package everything in a gatefold. It kind of depends. So we'll see what happens, I guess, with, say, the Jazz West title, the Pacific Jazz titles, maybe some of the Blue Notes. We just kind of have to see. So January 9th, 2026 is the first release date, and the Tone Poet Society exclusive title for Q1 is Blue Mitchell's Boss Horn. So this is one of those titles that hasn't yet been tackled in any of the recent Blue Note reissue programs. It was recorded in 1966, released in 1967, and this album came out from what I would call sort of the Duke Pearson era, because he was the A&R guy and he was the arranger for a lot of the sessions. If you think about the sort of boogaloo style of content, I think a lot of it is Pearson's doing. The lineup, though, includes Blue Mitchell on trumpet, Julian Priester on trombone, Junior Cook on tenor, Jerry Dodgen on alto, Pepper Adams on baritone, Gene Taylor on bass, Cedar Walton and Chick Corea trade off piano duties, and then you have Mickey Roker on drums. So this is a relatively big lineup, I would say, for Blue Note, with 5 horns, and it does sound bigger as well, with sort of heavier kind of I guess like shout sections and sort of solo accents. But I think still a great album, and I think. The reason why I think it's a great inclusion for the quarterly exclusive is because you don't want to like lock up a title that is just going to be massively popular for everyone as the exclusive, right? Like, you do want to make it special, but you don't want to lock up like a classic title that everybody is going to want. So I think this is a good inclusion because it, I don't want to call it a deep cut, but it's like, it is a little bit lesser of a known album. As well as the fact, again, that it hasn't been tackled as part of these other reissues. So there is something still sort of special about it. And let's be real, I think this is a great album. There's some people that say that Blue Mitchell's not their favorite trumpet player. I love Blue Mitchell. I love really everything that he's done. In fact, the first Blue Note album I ever bought was his Collision in Black. So anyway, So I'm a fan of that one. Otherwise, on January 9th as well, in terms of the standard series, right, we have Hank Mobley's album, Hank. So this was originally put out in 1957. This one features, of course, Hank Mobley on tenor. We also have John Jenkins on alto, Donald Byrd on trumpet, Bobby Timmons on piano, Wilbur Ware on bass, and Philly Joe Jones on drums. So this is being released in mono. And by the way, I'll try to specifically call out the releases that I at least believe will be in mono. This one I'm certain is going to be in mono because they've actually already released some of the details. But there's some of these coming up in the 1500 series that could go one way or the other, and I don't like to speculate. So I'm going to try to call out the ones where I think maybe there's a little bit of uncertainty. But again, this one will be in mono. The other standard title for January is this one. So this is Natural Essence by Tyrone Washington. This is sort of an under the radar title, but it is quite excellent, very much worthy of your attention. And in fact, this is also one of those titles that hasn't been a part of any other reissue program. So the lineup on this one includes Tyrone Washington on tenor, Woody Shaw on trumpet, Kenny Barron on piano, James Spaulding on alto and flute, Reggie Workman on bass, and Joe Chambers on drums. Fantastic lineup there. Stylistically, this is what I would call more of a post-bop style. Washington's playing is fiery, it's complex, and generally this is not your standard 60s toe tapper, which I actually think for that reason is going to appeal to a lot of folks who are really getting into that kind of, more late 60s or early 70s sound. All right, moving on to February 6th. This next one is a classic. Took me a long time to find it in its original form, and that is Lee Morgan's City Lights. Now, technically, this could fall in the window of being able to leverage a stereo master tape because Rudy was simultaneously recording in mono and stereo at the time. And guess what? My sources tell me that this will indeed be a stereo release, which I think is going to be a treat for us to hear. So this album was put out in 1958, and I love the lineup. You've got Lee Morgan on trumpet, Curtis Fuller on trombone, George Coleman on tenor and alto, Ray Bryant on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and Art Taylor on drums. This one was featured in the 2006 Classic Records series, but let's be real, 2006 was a long time ago, and even that edition goes for close to $200. If you want an original these days, it's going to be over $1,000. Next up for February is Benny Green's Back on the Scene, put out in 1958. This one will probably be a mono release, but we'll see. The lineup includes Benny Green on trombone, Charlie Rouse on tenor, Joe Knight on piano, George Tucker on bass, and Lewis Hayes on drums. Definitely a classic era release and not an album that a lot of people have heard. It feels to me like some of the Benny Green stuff is just not quite as prominent, but I think this is fantastic stuff. All right, on March 6th, we have a really exciting non-Blue Note title, and that is Lawrence Marable's Tenor Man. This is one of only a few that I won't be able to show you a physical copy of because it's impossible to find an original of the album. When I say impossible, you really have to understand. So not only are there no copies for sale currently on Discogs, the last copy that sold on Discogs was 2.5 years ago. Only 30 people have cataloged it in their collection on Discogs, and the last time it was reissued on vinyl in the US was never. This is a 1956 album for the Jazz West label, and the lineup includes Lawrence Marable on drums, James Clay on tenor, Sonny Clark on piano, and Jimmy Bond on bass. This one will also be in mono, and I really can't wait to hear it. Also on March 6th, we have Andrew Hill's Compulsion with 5 exclamation points because it hasn't been given a quality reissue until now. So this was originally recorded in 1965, but not put out until 1967. Compulsion has been a fairly difficult album to grab lately as well. So the lineup on this sort of free jazz, pensive album includes, of course, Andrew Hill on piano. We have John Gilmore on tenor and bass clarinet. We have Freddie Hubbard on trumpet and flugelhorn. Joe Chambers on drums, Nadi Kamar on African drums and thumb piano. Renaud Simmons on congas, and then bass duties are split between Cecil McBee and Richard Davis. Moving ahead to April 3rd, we have Fred Jackson's Hootin' and Tootin'. This was featured by Analog Productions some years ago, but otherwise hasn't been tackled in any of the familiar reissue programs. It's a little bit of an unusual title in my mind, even just in like the Blue Note catalog, maybe in general, in terms of the lineup. So you've got Fred Jackson on tenor, Earl Van Dyke on organ, Willie Jones on guitar, and Wilbert, aka Wilbur Hogan, on drums. So this is like a bluesy soul kind of album, and in fact, the only album that Fred Jackson ever recorded as a leader. Though he does appear on Babyface Willette's Face to Face, and he also appears on some John Patton records. But generally speaking, this is just a really tough grab to get in original, not only an original of, but in decent shape. I've gone through maybe 3 copies and sort of topped out at a VG level. So I am interested in being able to get a decent copy of this one. So next up in April is an originally shelved title, and that is called Larry Young's Mothership. So this is recorded in 1969, but not put out until 1980 in the LT series. So on this album, it's Larry Young on organ, Herbert Morgan playing some really excellent tenor, Lee Morgan on trumpet, and Eddie Gladden on drums. I do believe that this will be the first time that this album has been remastered for vinyl. And for those of you wondering what to expect, I'd call this one sort of spacey, even acidy stuff, and definitely not what you'd expect out of a jazz organ record for Blue Note. So it's kind of an interesting, combination of records. It feels to me for April, where even though Hootin' and Tootin', Fred Jackson's not an organ player, it is sort of more the soul organ with tenor kind of format. And then you move on to Larry Young, who's playing a very different kind of organ that's nevertheless fantastic, but also very unusual for the label. On May 1st, we have Dexter Calling by Dexter Gordon, recorded in 1961. There's some familiar folks here. We have, of course, Dexter Gordon on tenor. We have Kenny Drew on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and Philly Joe Jones on drums. This has had a few iterations in terms of reissues, including on Classic Records. There was a VMP edition, as well as an Analog Productions 45 RPM version. But it's well worth your attention, and great to have it in the Tone Poet series. I love the Dexter quartet stuff where there's no other horns in focus, and so the focus is very much kept on him. And I think that this album just sounds particularly well recorded, even within the context of the rest of the label, right? Like already there's a high bar, but this one just sounds fantastic, even just amongst the rest of the label. So the other title for May is McCoy Tyner's Asante, recorded in 1970, but not released until 1974. There's only been one reissue of this on vinyl ever, and that was in 1977, so it has indeed been a while for this one. In terms of format, or in terms of, I guess, the feel of this is that kind of earthy, spiritual sort of music that McCoy was doing in the 1970s, and I think a great example of it. The lineup on this is also very interesting if you love the era. So it's Tyner on piano, Andrew White on alto, Buster Williams on bass, M. Tume on congas, Billy Hart on drums, and Ted Dunbar on guitar. Incidentally, this is a Duke Pearson produced album, but very much without the sort of boogaloo style that he helped champion on so many other records. Moving on to June 5th, we have Curtis Amy's Tippin' On Through. This is recorded live at the Lighthouse at Hermosa Beach. The last time this was released was in the late 60s. In fact, it's never appeared on CD in any country at any time. The lineup here is Curtis Amy on tenor, Roy Ayers on vibes, Roy Brewster on valve trombone, John Houston on piano, Bob Whitlock on bass, and Lawrence Marable on drums. I am super interested to hear how this is with the reissue, given that my only point of reference is this original mono copy, which admittedly is not in the best shape. So next up, though, in June is a really exciting title that probably me and many others have been talking about, wanting included for the Tone Poet series for a while, and that is Bobby Hutcherson's Components. So this was indeed in the Blue Note 75 series, but come on, that shouldn't really count. This really has been missing, I think, from the sort of the quality reissue programs of the past. So it's hard to pin down this album in terms of calling it a specific subgenre of jazz, and there are many elements going on here, but I think if you love Hutcherson's work, you're going to no doubt love this album as well. Aside from Hutcherson, who plays vibes and marimba here, we have Freddie Hubbard on trumpet, Herbie Hancock on piano, Joe Chambers on drums, Ron Carter on bass, and then James Spaulding once again on alto and flute. James Spaulding's showing up quite a bit on some of these albums, it seems. Maybe we'll see at the end who's the musician that showed up on the most releases in the schedule. All right, so on July 3rd, we have Big John Patton's Got a Good Thing Going, first put out in 1966. I have to say, ever since I started DJing, I've fallen in love again with a bunch of titles like this one. The opener, titled The Yodel, works, I think, really well, like at a cocktail bar or sort of listening bar. Anyway, the lineup here includes John Patton on organ, Grant Green on guitar, Richard Landrum on congas, and Hugh Walker on drums. Patton didn't need any of the Duke Pearson charts here. He's able to bring sort of all the soul himself. And I think that this album represents some of the best of his style. So this is a really exciting one. I love this album. Also in July is Michel Petrucciani. I think that's how you pronounce his name, but I don't really know. Jim Hall and Wayne Shorter, and the album is titled Power of Three. This was first released in 1986. This is the only one in the series that I, sort of what I'd call the modern era that they're including in the Tone Poet calendar for 2026. And I'd actually never heard it until they announced it in the series the other day. This one was recorded at the Montreux Jazz Festival in 1986, and the format here, there's 4 duet tracks with Petrucciani and Hall, and then Shorter joins for the remaining 3. Now, I will say, it's going to be interesting to see how they do this one, because prior vinyl releases of this only feature 5 of the 7 total tracks. So when they put it out on CD, they had all 7, but they truncated it to 5 for the vinyl release. So I think it's going to be interesting to see whether they're able to squeeze it all in one disc. Are they going to do a 2-disc, or are they just going to stick with reissuing it on vinyl as it's been in the past, 5 tracks, single disc. All right, on August 7th, we have the originally shelved Jackie McLean album titled Vertigo. This is a bit of a curious release, even when it was first released in 1980, because it combines what are mostly tracks from a session in 1963 with a single track from 1959. This has never been remastered for vinyl, I believe, so this is very exciting. Incidentally, this is the LT Series cover. There already is another cover version that's out there that was reissued later. It's likely that they'll go with that, or at least something that's certainly more inspired than this. The lineup here includes Jackie McLean on alto, either Butch Warren or Paul Chambers on bass. Drum duties are split between Tony Williams and Pete LaRocca. Herbie Hancock and Walter Davis are on piano, and then we have Donald Byrd on trumpet. So how this works is Walter Davis, Paul Chambers, and Pete LaRocca support McLean and Byrd on one of the tracks, and the rest of the tracks are Warren, Hancock, and Williams with McLean and Byrd. Now, this all assumes that they release Vertigo as it was released in 1980. And I say that because there are other Blue Note releases of Vertigo that combine the larger 1963 session with a completely different session from 1962 that was also shelved, and it's never been released in any decent reissue series. So there's a few possibilities here. Apologies if that's confusing. My guess is they're going to be releasing this one in terms of the track listing. All right, on September 4th, we have Sonny Rollins Volume 2 from 1957, and I believe this will be in mono. The style here is high-energy hard bop, and the lineup is pretty astounding. So it's Sonny Rollins on tenor, J.J. Johnson on trombone, Horace Silver on piano, as well as Thelonious Monk on piano. They sort of trade off, I think. Paul Chambers on bass, and Art Blakey on drums. So, like, if they were drafting the all-star team from the era, this is sort of what you'd get. This is also Hackensack era in terms of where Rudy Van Gelder's studio was. The sound is a bit more, well, Hackensack in sound, but great renditions of some classics like Monk's Mysterioso and Reflections, as well as some Rollins originals. It's a fantastic album. Also in September, we have Sam Rivers, Dimensions and Extensions. This was originally planned for catalog number 4261, but shelved and then not even really included in the LT series. So it was recorded in 1967 and put out first as part of a double album titled Involution in 1976, and then as a standalone album as seen here in 1986 in the DMM series. So we do have a perfect cover for it because guess what? Reed Miles designed it before they, seemingly before they pulled it from the calendar. The lineup on this includes Sam Rivers on tenor, soprano, and flute. We have Donald Byrd on trumpet, Julian Priester on trombone, James Spaulding is back on alto, Cecil McBee on bass, and Steve Ellington on drums. So again, Is James Spaulding going to be the most represented musician in the series for 2026? We'll see. Stylistically, this is going to be more in the avant-garde vein. And in fact, I think one of the most adventurous titles in the entire 2026 release calendar. On October 2nd, we have Freddie Hubbard's Hubcap, put out in 1961. This title had an Analog Productions reissue, but otherwise nothing until now. I really love this album, actually, because I think it's a mix of Hubbard's sort of more straight-ahead work with kind of a little bit of more interest around, like there's an unusual ballad called Cry Me Not that I think really highlights his sort of more complex lyrical style. So I think in a way it kind of bridges maybe a little bit more of his classic sound and where he would take his playing even in the mid-60s for Blue Note. Overall, this album does have more complicated arrangements than you'd expect, but I think it works very well. So Hubbard on trumpet, Julian Priester on trombone, Jimmy Heath on tenor, Cedar Walton on piano, Larry Ridley on bass, and Philly Joe Jones on drums. This one was not originally released in mono at all. In fact, it wasn't until a Japanese reissue in 1976, but technically the only master tape of this would be stereo, and the original mono would have been a fold down. So my guess, it's just a guess, is that they're going to be putting out in stereo, just like how Analog Productions did it. The next title for October is Booker Ervin's Structurally Sound, recorded by Pacific Jazz in 1966 and put out in 1967. We have a very welcome appearance, in my opinion, by a few familiar Strata East folks here, including Charles Tolliver on trumpet and John Hicks on piano, and then otherwise it's Red Mitchell on bass and Lenny McBrown on drums. I actually find this lineup quite interesting, and regardless, like I think it works very well, so I don't mean that in a bad way. I feel like that this lineup adds or sort of finds a way to add a lot of interest in material that otherwise could sound a little bit derivative. So what I mean is there's some heavily played standards here. But then we also have an original by Ervin and one by Tolliver, and even on like Take the A Train, which is a well-played standard, this lineup makes it fresh and exciting. So this is a stellar one that kind of goes under the radar. All right, so we're getting towards the end here, which is good because I'm losing my voice a bit. So on November 6th, we have Jimmy Smith's The Sermon, appearing for the first time in one of these, again, quality reissue programs. This was one of the first Blue Note albums that I ever found, not this copy, but I found it at Wuxt Tree Records in Decatur, Georgia. It was $10, but of course that was a while ago. The material here is from several sessions recorded in 1957 and 1958, and I'm quite sure it will be presented in stereo. Also, just 3 total tracks, and there's a 20-minute blowing session that takes up the entire first side. So anyway, the lineups here include, of course, Jimmy Smith, as well as Lee Morgan on each track, I think, and then they're joined on the 20-minute track by Tina Brooks, Art Blakey, Kenny Burrell, and Lou Donaldson. Then the next track includes George Coleman, Donald Bailey, and Eddie McFadden joining Jimmy and Lee. And the final track is Kenny Burrell and Art Blakey with Jimmy and Lee. And actually that final track is really nice. It's sort of this unexpected, quiet, but like beautiful ballad. Lee Morgan sounds great on it. The next one up for November is Hank Mobley's Dippin', recorded in 65 and released in 1966. Lee Morgan is back again here, along with Larry Ridley on bass, Billy Higgins on drums, and Harold Mayburn on piano. Mobley is still very much, in my opinion, playing inspired music here, but maybe a bit more subdued than his earlier stuff. For me, Ballin' is a highlight. It's the last track, but I think does a great job of highlighting each of the musicians, especially Mayburn. The Breakthrough is another good one, sort of straight ahead blues, kind of hard bop thing. The Vamp is stellar. Really, this whole album is just nonstop excellent music. This is another title that Analog Productions tackled with a 45 RPM version in the past, but that one's going to set you back over $100 in the or sort of in the aftermarket, and of course an original will be in the hundreds as well. So December 4th is when the last 2 will come out, and the first one I'm going to be talking about is one that I've been talking about for years on this channel. Though to be fair, I'm sure they chose this independent of me, as I know that they're formalizing release calendars like years in advance. But anyway, this is Curtis Fuller's Volume 3, originally recorded in 1957 and planned for a 1958 release, but not put out until 1960. Why I've been talking about this one for so long is because it hasn't been tackled by any of the reissue programs, and in fact hasn't been reissued in the United States on vinyl since 1966 and never been put out on CD in the US ever. Even that 1966 Liberty era reissue has sold for over $800. So, more than just lack of availability and rarity, right? This is a fantastic album. The lineup includes George Tucker on bass, Louis Hayes on drums, Sonny Clark on piano, Art Farmer on trumpet, and of course, Curtis Fuller on trombone. This is one we're going to have to wait for more information from the folks at Blue Note in terms of whether it will be in mono or stereo, but do know it was originally released only in mono. And the very last one is Lee Morgan's The Sixth Sense. Now listen, I'm here for anything Lee Morgan, and especially late period Lee Morgan. I absolutely love it. So on this one we have Jackie McLean on alto, Frank Mitchell on tenor, Cedar Walton on piano, Victor Sproles on bass, and Billy Higgins on drums. I just absolutely love it. I think part of it is the lore, like kind of knowing that that Lee Morgan wasn't going to be playing for that much longer. But I also think he was doing some of the most innovating that he did in his career very much towards the end, you know, sort of bridging like this era and the Lighthouse recordings era. I just think is absolutely fascinating stuff. All right, so that is the list. Obviously, we're going to have to wait a little bit for the other quarterly exclusive titles. Usually, I think they announce those maybe like a month or so in advance. So what am I looking forward to most? Well, as I said up front, I really love those originally shelved titles because in many cases it's the first opportunity to get a decent reissue, like a nicely done reissue. So the ones I'm talking about are Jackie McLean's Vertigo, Larry Young's Mothership, and Sam Rivers' Dimensions and Extensions. I also really love that they're tackling Lawrence Marable's Tenorman because I've never had a copy in vinyl and probably wouldn't be able to get one otherwise. Bossa Nova Soul Samba. I mean, yes, I have an original, but would I like a tone poet of one of my favorite albums of all time? Absolutely. I'm also really interested to see what happens with some of the 1500 series stuff, both in terms of how it's going to sound, but also this idea of stereo, possibly for the first time on some of these, or are they going with mono? And a lot of those 1500 series titles are just out of hand, or excuse me, out of reach for so many because they're so expensive. So, you know, I'm talking about Hank Mobley's self-titled, Lee Morgan's City Lights, Curtis Fuller Volume 3, and certainly Sonny Rollins Volume 2 as well. I mean, these are absolute classics of the label. We also know that Bobby Hutcherson's Components has been one that is at the top of people's want list for a long time. So bringing that in, I think, is very good. Overall, I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why this list is a great one, and I think it demonstrates that the label is trying to go for titles that haven't had many reissues. They're also going for titles that people want, and that sort of cross the spectrum of hard bop to post bop to even some soul and even some avant-garde. So overall, in my opinion, a stellar list. Would love to hear what everyone else thinks about in the comments. So do drop a comment below, and I'll do my best to respond if it's directed at least at anything that I said. So without, I guess, I think that's it for me. I hope this was helpful for folks who are planning, you know, what your purchases are going to be. Are you going to join that society for 2026? So that's it for today. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next time.